Okay.
The employer's rate is the sum of 8.25% and 8.662.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So causes of change, as promised in the additional revenue needed. As we saw for the 2013 valuation, we needed 13.4% of pay additional to bring us up to full funding. And as expected, due to the funding legislation, we exactly offset that. And that's because all the projections that were done for that funding legislation as of 2014, those were based on that 2013 valuation. So now we come to the 2014 actual valuation. We had this good asset gain. That means we need even less additional revenue than we otherwise thought. So again, we have a couple of minor impacts. The salary increases less than assumed and all other sources. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that the 2014 valuation, we have a negative 1.1% additional revenue needed. And so as I mentioned earlier, what that really means is if everything else went according to plan, we would project some decreases in the ultimate rates as allowed under the funding legislation. And that's certainly going to change from year to year. It's also important to point out that, I think we're missing a slide here.
Oh, guess
Well-
I get to take over.
Well, I do want to just mention this. We do have a slide, and I'm not sure if it's in your packets or not, but one thing that's is important to point out is that there's a lot of sensitivity to the investment return assumption. So this chart that we had added, basically it just shows the total revenue needed under a 7.5% investment return assumption, and then your 25th and 75th percentiles. And the entire takeaway is, depending on what your assets return, you could have much more money than you need, or you could have certainly not enough money. So again, I mean, we're all very familiar with that concept, but
It's
just,
the chart she's referring to is on page TRB 264. It's that chart.
Rosen still has a question.
Yeah, I have a question about that. So I'm wondering why it's shown this way in terms of what the additional contribution would have to be, as opposed to, given that we just went through a major effort to get additional contributions, we're not likely to get contributions going up to 50% to cover a 5.7% return anytime soon. So I'm wondering what the answer would be if we looked at it differently, which is to say, if we earned 5.7% or we earned 9.1%, where would we be in terms of our funding over time? In other words, what would that graph look like that, you know, has the on TRB 262 that shows the red line going up, which should be the green line, and the green line going down, which should be the red line. What would that look like if we were at the 25th and the 75th percentile?
Yeah, let me just say, you know, we were requested to put this one in there just for consistency with the prior ones. And one change we did was instead of saying additional revenue needed, we changed it to total revenue needed, just as different. But we have so much information here in the evaluation that's new. But one thing we did in the process of when we're doing the evaluation is we set up a model that we can input variables such as what is the future investment return and see how the impact is. So we have that information, and it'd be easy to provide if you were interested.
Because I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to get back. We're trying eventually to merge what we're doing here with what we're doing in the asset allocation study, so that we can be looking at sort of cash flows, both what's going in from contribution, what's coming out for benefit payments, what's hopefully coming in from investment earnings, and see how it all kind of comes together, because we know we're not going to get 7.5% each and every year. We may average 7.5%, but there's going to be variability. So I'm just wondering when I guess I was hoping to see a little bit more progress in that direction, maybe at least a table that showed the cash flows of contributions, payments, and investment earnings, even if it's at 7.5%, but seeing that over time. And we get bits and pieces of it, but it's sort of not all put together, which I think helps us understand kind of the dynamics of how we get to that final answer. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing that I think it's probably valuable now that the board is sort of embarking on a new set the responsibilities of setting contribution rates, I think it's a good opportunity to sort of give some thought about what information would be most helpful for you. I think one of the things in terms of this chart, I mean, well, I can certainly appreciate what you're suggesting. I think it's also important to recognize that to the extent that that the investment returns are different than what we assume, it will have an effect upon the contribution rates that ultimately the board is going to set. So I think it's worth seeing how sensitive it is to that. Right. But I think, like I said, now that you've got different responsibilities than you've had in the past, I think it's sort of an opportunity to sort of take a look at what would be the kind of information that future valuations ought to look at, and that would be certainly something to look at.
That'd be very helpful.
Yeah, and when would we think, like sometime next year, start looking at those?
We could, I mean, I think we give some thought in terms of what the valuation that we do next year would look like, and I think we just want to figure out how to have that conversation with the board about what is it would be most helpful for you to know, and maybe starting out with what the consultants think would be helpful for you to know, given what it is your authority is, and we can sort of start from there.
Yeah, I'd add that's something we usually like to add, but we just had so much information, which I'm going to go into the new information here, so we just wouldn't want to bog you down too much. So I will try to move through this fairly quickly, but since it's new information, feel free to ask questions. But this is kind of, how the valuation policy works under this new funding paradigm. I was told by certain people who looked over my PowerPoint that maybe this was a confusing graph, but I think that the valuation has got complicated to incorporate all the new funding legislations. We have these different pieces. We're running kind of different valuations. Some of them are sort of even less tangible than actuarial work usually is. But so I just point to this one. If you look on the far right, you see the green is the assets and the blue is the unfunded actual obligation. So you see that, so that would make a total obligation if you add the two of about $230 billion, which Jen talked about, of about $70 billion, which is the unfunded. And this, the far right bars, that's exactly what Jen's been talking about in the valuation, and that is basically what we've been doing, the same valuation process we've been doing for a number of years. The one on the far left is the 1990 benefit structure, which we have been doing for a number of years. We're doing a separate valuation based on this, and this is where I talked about this kind of gets hypothetical because we have to estimate what the benefit payments for these people were based on the 1990 benefit structure as opposed to the actual benefits they're getting paid, and track the assets. And there's a lot of complexities to that, but we think we've done a pretty good job of mirroring that, and that's something we've done for a number of years, so we've kept the same process there. And then in the middle, there's two new valuations that are being done. One is pre-2014 service. The funding legislation said the district was responsible for the unfunded for pre-2014 service. Now, the one to the right of that is the state is responsible for effectively responsible their contribution rate to fund the 1990 structure, which overlaps with the pre-2014 service, but also has benefits that are being earned in the future. So what we've done is we've isolated the 1990 structure for pre-2014 service, figured out the unfunded is, and the difference we've assessed what is the responsibility of the state based on the process, and then we've assessed what the responsibility of the district is, kind of the remaining piece. So there's quite a bit going on here, but what I really want to do when talking about this is kind of talk about the implications of that, and I've talked to you about them before, but we can kind of actually see them in practice as we go through this. This is the allocation of funding. This is literally just kind of what I just said in words. The one thing I would say that I didn't mention is there's a missing piece, which Dana alluded to last time, which is there's a piece that is not the responsibility of the districts or the state, or not the explicit responsibility under the funding legislation, where there's going to be new benefits. That is the benefits not attributable to 1990 structure that occur after 2014. And so there's going to be an unfunded or an overfunded that's going to develop for those new benefits, and we'll continue to monitor those going forward. Oops, let's try that one. So really the key outcome of the future valuations is going to be the calculation of the supplemental rate for the employer and the districts that's in the funding legislation that we are going to recommend to you. As you see, that's not going to occur till, it's actually pretty soon for the state, the 2016 valuation. We will recommend adjustments to the ultimate graded supplemental rate, which is currently about 4.3, which is going up to 4.3% for the state, and also changes to the employer supplemental contribution rate, which is grades up to 10.85 by 2021. So in the 2020 valuation, we'll review is that sufficient to fund the unfunded allocated to allocated to the employers, or do we need to adjust it? And that's where we'll make recommendations on how to adjust the rate. And we've actually shown these rates as if this valuation was one where we'd make adjustments. And what you would see is the state, if this is obviously purely hypothetical, but this is just in the vein of, taking this for a test drive. What you see is state would have had a significant decrease in their rate based on our calculations. But what might be a little bit counterintuitive is that the employer rate would have actually gone up slightly from that 10.85% ultimate rate. And the reason for that is the way the assets are allocated on this hypothetical basis that we've talked about, the state has actually allocated extra assets than because of the way the 1990 structure versus the actual funding occurred. So you would actually see a small increase if everything went according to plan. But the difference is that these are based on smoothed assets, so we actually have done a projection based on reflecting the gains and losses as they flow through the pipeline, and that means based on that there's actually a projected small decrease in employer rate. So there's a lot going on, and the reason there's a projection is a small in the employer rate is that when we look at the employer rate, if the plan gets we look at the total contribution that we would need, just in big picture, how much do we need to fund it, and then we look at each of the components, and basically each of the components added up more than the total rate needed based on our projections. Therefore, the employer rate got a little bit of a break on that. And a lot of this stuff is going to change from now until the future. But we just kind of want to let you know there's going to be quite a bit going on there. And this is what we talked about, the projected rates, and I think this is going to be a little bit easier to follow. And this was I talking to Paul about, is we now have this model set up where we can, we've incorporated all the intricacies of the new valuation policy in this model, and now we could say, well, if we earn the 25th percentile going forward, how would that look? Or if we earn the 75th percentile, how would that look on the funded ratio or the employer contribution rates? So this kind of shows the three components, the red line being the state. You see the graded increases that are going to occur over the next couple of years. And then if we, as Jen talked about, we did the valuation, we just assumed it was kind of flat at that point. But the reality is it's going to go up or go down. Well, the great asset returns flow through, and as we talked about in the valuation policy, the state is really going to have variable contribution rates, more so than the employer, because of the way the assets are allocated. So that, as you see, this time the variability as we project, because of the good asset returns, we see a big decrease in the state rate from just about 6%, which is the little over 4% ultimate supplemental rate, plus the base 2% rate that the state is paying. So you see it would actually go, instead of at 6%, it would drop almost immediately back down to the 2% base rate. So that would be really good news for the state. And as you see, virtually nothing happens to the employer rate, the green rate. You see it go up, and then the projected rate versus the ultimate rate are very little difference. And that's because the way the assets allocation is going to flow through, as I said, to the state rate is going to be very variable, and the employer rate is going to move up and down a little bit, but not as much, and sometimes will move in opposite directions of the state rate. And lastly, we have the member rate. As you see, we've got the scheduled increases over the next couple of years, and actually the employee rates are going to be flat as they're not variable. There's actually a slight decrease, as you see, as we would get more members in the 2% at 62 than the 2% at 60 who pay a slightly lower employer rate.
Dick, I was just going to add one thing. It's funny. Although you might consider 31 years in perpetuity, obviously it's not, and those rates do go down at some point. And I think we do have some communication to do more on this as these rates ramp up for the schools over the next 6 years. and we start to feel more of that financial stress and this perception of how they're going to budget for that. In a speech, as Cassandra and I did a couple weeks back, our audience of members were quite surprised to hear that the rates would ultimately go down, that this was dealing with, if you want to call it, a temporary issue of the unfunded obligation. There was a strong perception these rates were permanent forever for the schools. So I can tell we need to reinforce those messages as those rates ramp up, that that's not the case, even though it is a long time.
And I think the next two slides are really going to give you really going to drive home the point of the way the state unfunded is going to move, and the state supplemental contribution rate is going to move based on the investment return much more so than the employer piece. You see, this is basically when we were back assisting staff with the funding legislation of doing the calculations. We were doing projections. As you can see, on the left-hand side, the green is the pre-2014 service for new benefits, that unfunded, which is effectively what is being allocated to the employers. You can see that was going to be close to 60 billion. As Jen said, it was projected to be about 80 billion. You can see we expected the employers to have about 60 billion in unfunded and the state to have about 20 billion. And as you can see, they both get paid off over that period. And then there's a third piece there, which is the piece that doesn't have any direct funding attributable for the state or the district, which is the post-2014 service for new benefits. And that's good, as you can't see that because we want that to stay at zero. But I think what you'll see as we move forward here, as you see, and just going back and forth, you see the way the red moves, that's the state unfunded. Good investment returns almost entirely flow into the state piece. The employer piece stays almost exactly the same. And if next year, we fall short of our assumption, you're going to see that red piece grow back, and you'll still see the green piece look very similar to what it is today. So that's just driving home, and that's, the changes in the way the unfunded is allocated is going to flow through to the contribution rates, obviously. And just one other thing is that, once again, that blue piece, which is the piece that doesn't have any direct funding, we've set it up so that the normal cost, based on the valuation policy, the contributions are equal to the normal cost. That is the value of the benefits. So we get contributions equal to the value of the benefits coming in. So theoretically, if all our assumptions are being made, there shouldn't be an unfunded that'll develop based on the blue piece. But obviously, ultimately, there is going to be some unfunded, either yes or no. But it's good to see that at this point that we've set our target correctly. So hopefully we will be close going forward, and there won't be too much of an issue there. And then just lastly, kind of our initial impressions after having taken this for a test drive. We saw some progress on the funding ratio, but even though we had a really good return, it was kind of only a small improvement. Obviously, that's partly due to smoothing. And as Jen alluded to, right now the contributions really haven't turned the corner where it's not the contributions are not driving up the funded ratio. They should be in a few years, but right now it was strictly the investment returns that offset the fact that we don't have enough current contributions to make progress on the unfunded. Second point is, I think I really drove that one home, which is the good returns will reduce the state contribution rate, and bad returns will tend to increase it. The employer rate shouldn't move nearly as much, but it could go up or down depending on a few variables. As I talked about, I think we've pretty good alignment on that orphan piece, that we don't have specific funding except for the normal cost contributions. And lastly, as I talked about, when we're going to do the contribution rates, we're going to do it based on the smoothed assets, and we will do some projections. When we project that forward, the picture might actually be better, like in this case for the employers. If we did a snapshot right now on the smooth value of assets, it wouldn't look quite as good as if we project out those gains. So, in conclusion, the current DB program is projected to be sufficient based on all the assumptions that Jen alluded to, and we expect progress toward the 100% funding, but it's going to take time, and obviously investment returns will have a big impact on that, and we'll continue to monitor that going forward, and that concludes our presentation.
Very good. Yay. No little smiley face at the end of the slide or anything. Do you guys want to break maybe before we do the next part? Yeah.
We need to
on
adopt
that
the
particular
resolution.
piece? Sure. Okay.
Yeah, we do need,
Okay.
you do,
And then-
there is an action item, you need to adopt the resolution.
Say
of
that
it.
again?
There is
Yeah,
an
no,
action,
I
okay.
got that,
okay.
but I just want to make sure Tom?
Just a comment, the graphical depictions, I thought were really effective.
Yeah.
Really made something almost incomprehensible comprehensible. So very-
Especially when you get those multiple valuations, it makes it very difficult, yeah.
Jennifer, you did a great job your first time in front of us, thank you.
Yeah, it's
No.
nice,
You
nice to
passed
see
the
it.
test.
Nice to see a new face too. So good.
Don't tell
Ed-
Mark that.
Another way of saying, you can keep Mark,
Mark took that personally.
clean off a Mark. This is an action item.
Yes.
So the recommendation is before us. There are other questions or comments. Ed, is there anything else that we need to cover before we vote on it? We're good, right? Yeah,
voting
so
on
it's
the first
before
item,
us.
right?
So we're
14A?
voting on
Move to adopt.
move to adopt. Dana's made motion to
Second.
move to adopt the recommendation, seconded by Sharon. Any other further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, why don't we take a break till 3 o'clock? Is that okay? So people, if they,
I do have a
That works.
question.
yeah, Tom.
Why do we adopt these?
Legal counsel, you wanna, the question was, why do we take a
I mean-
formal motion to adopt these
I
recommendations?
mean, we can't change them.
Or receive.
I researched the law. There's actually no particular requirement to adopt this particular valuation. There are requirements under the funding strategy to adopt in the future, to adopt actuarial evaluations. But I could not find a present requirement for you to adopt it. I don't know if it's a historical issue or if it's a policy.
Well, we look
My- Yeah.
If we're not required to, and there's nothing that requires us to do so, maybe going forward we won't, but we can look into it.
I'm in
I mean,
favor of
What
that.
would happen if we said no?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we,
The one thing is you have to adopt, I think you have to adopt the normal clause, 262.
But, yeah, under
Yeah.
Prop 6, yeah.
all right, so we're gonna take a break till 3.
One is the DBS valuation. So you bring up that slide, 24, I think it was.
Yeah.
These will go much faster.
This is 14, what, at 14B, 14B, C, and D?
Yes.
Right. I think the guys are working on the slides
Are
here.
you finding the file?
Okay, so we're gonna very quickly go over the results of both the Defined Benefit Supplement DBS program and the Cash Balance Benefit CBB program. These programs have a lot of similarities. As you talked about earlier, just adopted a new interest crediting policy for those. So we are gonna reissue those reports, they're draft right now, talking about the additional credits that will be granted. So there will be more to come on these. This is just gonna be a very concise overview of the valuation results. The main point of doing these valuations is to determine the financial conditions of both the DBS and CBB programs. We look at the fair market value of assets, which we call the actuarial value of assets, but for these programs, the two are identical. We look at the actuarial obligation, and then we take a look at the funded status. And the funded status is really what can potentially trigger the granting of those additional credits, which makes sense since the entire design is to kind of share out those gains over time. So actions, obviously the board has already considered the interest crediting policy. So we're basically just gonna take a look at the valuation results right now and then the results of the interest crediting policy at a later time. So the bottom line as of June 30th, 2014, again, results being shown prior to the additional credits. Both programs are in an actuarial surplus position as of June 30th, 2014, so this is great. And in fact, they're very strong surplus positions right now. Funded status is on both programs increased over the prior year. So DBS is now at 121% funded prior to any additional credits, and CBB is at 121.7% funded prior to the additional credits. This, again, as we saw with the DB program, is because we had an excellent investment return year. So we had investment returns greater than assumed. In addition to that, the credits that were granted, the regular interest credits, were less than the assumed rates. So we assume that, long-term, those credits are going to be equal to the long-term rate of return assumption. And so those were smaller, so we got gains on that as well.
Ms. Senta, I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you. Mr. Huntsman has a question or comment.
Yeah, I'm curious whether you use pretty much the same smoothing mechanism that you do for the DB, because I'm sort of surprised by the.
Yeah, it's an
this-
excellent question. Actually, it was very briefly mentioned on the last slide, but for these programs, we use just the market value of assets.
So you
there-
don't smooth?
There is no smoothing. Yeah, in the reports, we still call it the actuarial value of assets, but that's the actuarial value of assets is we set it equal to the market value. Yes.
And that exactly like you alluded to, that's what drove the big increase that occurred in these plans, where we only saw a smaller increase in the DB
Yeah,
program.
because when I remember back to the meeting earlier, when we were talking about the credits, we were talking about a very different scale and numbers, so.
Yes, that's also a great point.
Before you
And
continue,
how sensitive would it be to, say, 100 basis points of outperformance or underperformance?
This funding?
So when you make 8.5%, how much does it go up? When you make 6.5%, how much does it go down?
It's gonna go down about 1%. It's a little bit, because it's overfunded, it's actually, the assets are gonna have a bigger impact. So it's
Yeah.
gonna go up 1.2% or down 1.2%.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then, there's additional credits that trigger, so it kind of obfuscates the whole thing.
Okay. Thanks.
But the difference is that you're only guaranteeing 3.5%. So, I mean, that's really what's going to affect the funded ratio. As long as you're above that, you're still in the good side.
on that point, I think Dana has a point that's on this as well. So let me go to Dana first and then back to you, Paul. So Dana, go ahead.
So my question is, are we at 121% and 121.7% after doing the credits we did last year? Or is this prior? It's after.
It's after the credits last year, but before the credits you'll be doing in June.
Paul?
So, following up on Nick's comment in answer to Tom's question, so if we earn 7.5%, the funded status should not change, right?
No, I mean, alluding to Ed's point, if we're only crediting 3.5% on on the accounts, then we're assuming 7.5%. So therefore, if you earn 7.5%, you'd actually you'd have an outperformance. Now, where in your overfunded status, if you earn 7.5%, you may tend to fill up, make up the difference between 7.5 and that 3.5, and then you would end up being offset. But if you were just at 100% funded and you earn 7.5, you'd actually improve your funded status, assuming the minimum interest rate was less than 7.5.
So I'm still not quite sure how we got 15%, how we increased 15% funding. Because we didn't outperform our 7.5% by 14 or 15%.
Yeah, so you outperformed by about 11%. So that's 11%, and then the difference in the credits was another
But then
3
we
or
credited.
Yeah, it was
But
3 or
then we added an additional credit.
This is, the numbers that Jen showed were after the additional credits were granted last year.
But prior to anything this year.
But it's prior to any additional credits this year.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Till
got it,
June, right?
okay.
Or
Now
perhaps
it
June.
sort of all adds up, thank you.
So basically, given the fact that the standard deviation is about 14%, you're basically playing with that difference between 121% versus 114% is what is available for
Got it.
accrediting.
Got it. Okay.
Back to you, Ms. Senta.
So just looking a little more closely at the results of the DBS valuation, actual versus expected valuation results. As we mentioned, we use the fair market value, so we don't have any deferred gains or losses at this point. And the prior year return was 18.7%. So we got a big gain on that, on the asset side. But then, as we mentioned, and as there was just some discussion about, on the obligation side, we also got a gain. And that is because we assume that on a long-term basis, we're going to be crediting up at the level of the investment return assumption. That's because long-term, we are going to be sharing out excess gains, but the minimum interest rate is lower than that. So we get a gain on that as well. So we've got gains on the asset side, gains on the obligation side, and our total unfunded actuarial surplus in this case is about $1.8 billion. Then for CBB, it's a very similar picture. We again use the fair market value. We had a return of 18.4% for this program. It's invested slightly differently. Again, exact same primary sources of gains and losses. So you can see that our actual surplus on the, it's basically a negative unfunded actuarial obligation, is up to 41 million. It's a much smaller program, whereas we only expected it to be 13. So again, gains on both the asset and on the obligation side is the real takeaway here before we grant any of the additional credits that are under discussion. And that's it. Unless there are additional questions on this one?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Zeiger.
Why don't we smooth on this one when we smooth on the other one?
Is there a historical background there? I mean, it kind of makes sense, given the way that we're trying to, the way that we're trying to say, do we want to grant additional credits? We kind of need a measure of how funded we really are. There's no sort of contribution rate volatility to worry about here, so we're not as concerned with smoothing in the impacts of any big downturns. So, I mean, that would be my answer.
Yeah, there is some historical context here, but I wasn't here when we set up this program. But I think a lot of it is, as Jen said, I mean, it's not like if we're smoothing things, it's not like we're going to, the contribution rates are changing because of this. So that was one of the reasons it wasn't. And if you think about it, if you started looking at your actuarial return and comparing it to what the, minimum interest rate is, maybe that's not really the true measure of what, the members are, falling short. I mean, if you earn 7.5, on a market basis, that's literally, the difference between that is what, between the minimum interest rate and what you actually earned is a reasonable measure of what the difference in the additional credit should be.
I'm still a little short of.
Okay, so let me see if I can jump in.
I mean, do we not have to, do we have more ability to fluctuate what we pay these people? I mean, because it seems to me like, are we in the same bind? If we grant somebody something based on what it was, we don't get to back up from that.
No, but
Which is one of the reasons you want to smooth rates, is because you don't want to, in a good year, put yourself out there.
yeah, you don't.
Or-
A couple of things. So with the DBS and CBB programs, you are guaranteeing something less than what you really think you're going to make. So there's a difference there. With the DB program, we're actually basically guaranteeing an annuity what we make.
Right.
So in an annuity, and the 7.5, we priced our expected contributions based on 7.5 on a long-term basis. And so you want to make sure that when the market goes up and down over, say, a 5 or 7 year period, that you don't automatically change your contributions based on a 5 or 7 year stretch, that you look at it long term. And so the actual value assets help you kind of look at the market over a long term and set your contributions rates based on a long term market, not a short term. So your contribution rates with DB and CB are set. With the DB program, it's not set, that you're recommending a contribution rate. With DBS and CBB, the contribution rates are set. You're seeing how much you can pay based on what you have coming in.
Yeah, just the flip side of your question is, I mean, you could have situations if you use smooth assets where the market had gone down significantly, but your smooth, funded ratio was still high, so you could be giving additional credits when your funded ratio had dropped below 100%.
So when the market was less and we were not, did we pay less? To these folks,
We didn't
the
get
folks that
paid.
wanted
Yeah,
to,
we
the
did,
folks that wanted to take their money out.
We didn't give additional earning credit.
Right, they got what, they got the minimum interest rate, and that's all they got.
That's all I got.
Yeah.
And there was an unfunded liability, which
Yeah.
disappeared within a matter of a year or two. The other thing is that the gain and loss reserve, which is, is what provides that buffer against bad years. And now that you've got a much higher threshold before you give credits, you've got a much more substantial buffer against bad years.
Yeah.
So it's probably of less concern now than it would have been until there's a new policy.
But with those two, we don't set the rate, the contribution rates. We just set kind of the additional earnings credits.
Anything else? That's good.
Thank you.
Okay. Where are we at?
Well, I mean, based on Brian's concern, I was looking, there's no action to be taken because you're not awarding the credit at this point. So, I mean, the report's the report, and
so we're
they have to
just
come
accepting
back.
the report.
Yeah, they have to come back in June
Great.
for the actual action.
Good.
So there's not an issue with it saying
Moving on.
action on here?
We don't have to adopt the reports, okay. All right.
So
We
moving
continue?
on,
Yep.
our last valuation is medical premium payment program. Really, this is kind of case of deja vu all over again. If you remember way back when, for those of you around when this was originally set, the amount was set at $2 billion. And it was based on a survey of people expected to enroll who didn't have coverage under, under a spouse or other sources. Really what we've had is a we've continually adjusted our assumptions, and then we still have less people elect into this program, and that is one of the big factors on the cost of this program. And so we've had a continual decline in the obligation for the medical premium program. And if you remember, there's not any direct funding of this. It's actually, we just have a small reserve set aside, but we actually take it out of contributions coming to the DB program, and we have that we have the unfunded allocation. I mean, the unfunded actual obligation is effectively part of the DB program. As we account for that in the funding of the DB program, we fund extra so we can cover this MPP program, and this number keeps coming lower every year. And I'll talk quickly about why. For this, we're really just talking about a retired population. We have retirees that are currently in the MPP program, and the retirees who might join, particularly those who are retired and under 65. The things that drive cost are your investment return, your mortality assumption, how long people are living, receiving the Part A program, and lastly, one thing, well, there's a couple. One is the enrollment. As I said, really, that's really been a big driver over the years, that we've had less people enroll in this program, and that's resulted in cost savings. And lastly is how much the premiums, and really the Part A premium is like 99% of the cost, as opposed to the Part B penalty for that premium. So, and we have an expectation of those increases in the future. As you know, there was about 10 years ago, the expectation of medical costs were dramatic increases, but that really hasn't materialized as much as expected. So that our assumption has gone down on that. Benefits provided are for people who have retired versus June 30, 2012. You had a discussion about this yesterday. The premiums is really what the biggest story was this year, is the Part A premium, instead of increasing, as I said, we had an assumption of about 3.7% for increases every year. It actually decreased from $441 to $407. And flipping to this page, this shows that last valuation, which these are done every other year, we had about $424 million in the unfunded actual obligation that once it goes over the DB program, and that decreased primarily, as you see, $66 million of the $82 million increase was due to Part A premiums actually decreasing instead of the expected increase, which leaves our unfunded amount at about $342 million. as I said, there's about, right, the THBF holds monies that get used to pay the premiums, but at this point, it's basically on a basically month-to-month basis that contributions go into the THBF and they immediately go to the benefit. So it's really not a significant piece. It's only about $0.9 million. So you see the $342 million actual obligation, about $1 million in assets. So the $341 million is what we had in the DB program valuation. And just one other key point on this is that for GASB reporting purposes, since we do not have dedicated assets, and there's a legal reason that we don't have a dedicated asset fund, because if we ended up with too much assets, then we wouldn't necessarily be able to use them for DB for other purposes. So since we don't have a segregated asset pool, GASB requires that we use lower investment return assumption. As you can see, we use 3.5%, which results in a higher actual obligation that we use for GASB reporting purposes. And that is shown on the next page of about $481 million is our unfunded. We show a funded ratio of 0.2%, as I said, because we don't have those dedicated assets, although we do have obviously a funding mechanism to pay that, so it's not a concern, but it does, the appearance of that might not be as good. And I'm not sure how much people have heard about this if there's been a major concern over the years that we've been reporting this number. But that is it for the MPP program.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the committee? Okay, seeing none, we'll accept the report. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your time. Thanks for your work. Nice meeting you, Ms. Enta. Thank you. Ed, think about that. Technology is a disruptor to teaching.
Robot teachers.
Okay,
These are open meetings where just all this good stuff is going out into the.
so Ms. Madsen, good afternoon. Okay, this is the project funding, a request for some, a modest increase in some funding.
Right, so this is an adjustment to estimates. We did our estimate in preparation for your November budget approval, but as we have more information, we have been able to revise that estimate, and so this is a part of the spring finance letter / governor's revise process for the 15-16 budget, and so we're looking for your approval for that increase in our reappropriation authority, which will allow us to use unspent funds from fiscal year 13-14 and 14-15 in future years in support of the pension solution project, as well as data conversion and other ancillary tasks that are necessary to make that project a success.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee on this? Okay, seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to adopt the recommendation from staff, the increase amount. Moved by Ms. Ortega. Seconded by Ms. Elliott. No additional comments. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, Ms. Mattson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Item 16, the project risk oversight report. Graham Finley from Grant Thornton is with us. Is anyone else joining you, Graham? Is it you by yourself here?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Yes, today.
Very good. Just for informational purposes for the board, Joy and I spent a little time with Graham and Cassandra and Chris earlier this afternoon, just talking about trying to make sure that our needs are met during these presentations in this relationship that's going to be ongoing. So some of the feedback you've provided for us, Joy's offered some really good suggestions for, just want to let everyone know we're in communications with Graham, making sure our needs are being met. Go ahead.
No, thank you for that. I think we made a few changes to the format of our board item and presentation for this board meeting. I think we'll be making some additional ones for the June and onwards based on some of the conversations we had. So I think that'll be very useful. Thank you for that. What we did for for this month, you may notice, was change the format of the board item, and that we provided copies of the executive summaries for the working monthly reports that we provide to the executive sponsors and the project managers of each of the pension Business Renew projects, the Pension Solution and the Data Prep project. So you could look at those and identify the kind of topic areas and issues that we're discussing with the project teams. But what I wanted to do for the presentation was take it up a level and really just address a few key points that we felt were important for the board to be aware of at this point for each of the projects. And then after that, I'll simply take questions on anything from the executive summaries of the reports that you're interested in further discussing, or any other questions you have. Okay. So with that, so the key points we want to share with you this month on the Pension Solution and Data Preparation projects are as follows. So for Pension Solution, the project is on track to complete the negotiations with CGI as originally anticipated, and the expectation is that the project will be ready to start implementation work in the May-June timeframe, probably more likely June, but pretty much on track with the original schedule. There are a range of readiness activities that are going on the project, covering a lot of different topics. The one area that we do want to bring your attention to, though, and we talked about this last time we met, is the continued lack of a permanent project manager. The project had been planning to hire an individual who would be the permanent PM, and the expectation was, the desire was, that that person would be recruited by the spring so that they would be in place before the CGI team came on board and started work in earnest. We think at this point it's fairly likely that that will not actually occur, and so the project is exercising basically a contingency plan to look for contract support in the absence of a full-time permanent employee, at least as an interim step. So this is obviously a very key position that needs to be filled as soon as possible. So this is probably our number one item that we're keeping an eye on and wanting to make sure that the right person is in the position. And we believe, as I believe CalSTRS does, that it's much more important to have the right person than to have it filled quickly. But it is important to have this filled as quickly as possible. So that's really the biggest ticket item on the project right now in terms of readiness. There are a range of other readiness activities that are ongoing in terms of processes and tools and other types of staffing. Most of those are progressing reasonably well. This is the one item we wanted to draw your attention to at this time. With that, I'll take any other questions you have around pension.
Go ahead, Paul. Mr. Rosenstiel?
So, reading this, I need a little bit of translation because I'm not quite sure sometimes what's being said here. So when we talk about project sponsorship, what do you mean by project sponsorship? Is that different from the project manager?
Yes, it's distinctly different. So the project sponsor is a role, and at the moment that role is a dual-headed role with Ashish and Peggy, the co-project sponsors for the project. Basically, it's the executive sponsor. So not the person who's doing the day-to-day management, but the executive who is sponsoring the project.
Key staff members within the organization.
Yes, key executive staff members who are the ultimate sponsor and authority for the project.
And that's Ashish and currently Peggy.
And currently Peggy. And Peggy, as we all know, is unfortunately leaving us.
Until she leaves us. Whatever.
So that creates a transition. That there
So
will
that's
be
what you're referring to here, project sponsorship risk, what you're referring to is Peggy's retirement.
Yes.
Thank you.
In effect.
There we go. There we go. Thank you,
It would
Paul.
have, well, it would have been nice
We can't just say
to just
easily.
make, with Peggy retiring, there
Yeah,
it is.
well, that's actually one of the things, all kidding aside, Graham and I were on a call the other day with Cassandra. That's one of the things we want to work on is just in terms of language that's talked about and
Right.
brought
Right.
before us.
And I
It's
think
really
what-
bring it down to
What we
our level.
basically did this month was take our executive summary that we provided to the project sponsor and the project manager and copy it wholesale. But of course, there's a fair amount of insider information, I guess you could say, that wouldn't necessarily be immediately obvious to someone who wasn't actively involved
Right,
in the project.
because I had the same problem understanding procurement phase schedule, resource loading. That paragraph just went completely over my head. I had no idea what was.
Yeah, it's sort of a term of
there's
art. So I
a
think-
lot of
Just
jargon
guessing.
that I wish we could distill down to,
Change in our reporting.
I don't know what resource loading is. I don't, you know,
So
I don't know what baseline is. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. So if we could try to get
We're working on that,
Great,
and that's the
that'd be great.
purpose of the
Thank
meeting with Joy today and conversation we had on the phone the afternoon, and really just,
Good point.
we want to bring it down to.
plain language. And
Yeah, and we're simple
For the
folks.
board.
We're
Fifth
simple
grade.
folks. Okay, Ms. Ortega.
I just have a question about the project manager position and what kind of decisions cannot be made or steps cannot be taken in that when there's an absence, and then, so is there a contingency plan for what can be done with the absence?
There is.
Okay.
And I'll answer from my understanding of what it is. You know, Chris can provide more details. But at the moment, there's an interim project manager who's filling that position, and the project team is basically putting together if you like, a plan for who is going to cover the various areas of that project manager's responsibility in the absence of that permanent position. So they're going through the various sort of, roles and responsibilities of a project manager in the absence of that position, who will take on that role. But obviously it's not a complete, replacement. And having that individual with the right kind of background and experience is ultimately going to be necessary. It is a stopgap, though, that will, keep the project moving forward in the interim.
Mr. Zeiger?
In my experience, there are significant impediments to finding project managers for state projects. Can we talk a little about, our ability, we think, given those, are we going to be able to overcome them sometimes you get lucky and you find the right person, but these are really, they're inside the state, it's very difficult to find.
Cassandra, why don't you address that, because we talked about that on the phone.
Exactly, that's exactly the problem that we're having. We have the classification established in the civil service range to the highest level that we can for this type of a project at this time. We're looking at contingency plans like hiring a contractor, but we want to make sure that when we do hire a state staff, or even if it is a contractor through the RFO process, that we hire the right person with the right skills. And we don't want to just put a warm body in there. What part of the contingency plan that we are taking on to address Ms. Ortega's question is we do have an interim project manager in place. Chris is playing a more active role in the project itself, more at a deeper level. And the executives are, as the Business Renew Executive Steering Committee, are really having a closer oversight of the activities on the project. So there's a lot more executive involvement at this point because of the vacancies and the turnover that are occurring at the project manager level and the sponsor level. We are looking at what other alternatives we have within the state classification parameters, but you're right, sometimes you get lucky and find somebody that's wanting to transfer from another area to gain the experience, but this is a very big project. It's high risk. It has a lot of visibility, and a lot of people don't see the value in taking on that responsibility.
I don't doubt that you're doing all you can. I really think these are sort of institutional impediments as part of the state system that makes it extremely difficult to fill these roles with the right. I've gotten lucky, and it's really, but it really is luck, as opposed to I've got a system that's going to generate that person for me. And I just was, if there's any way, this is such a big project, and I suspect that your project managers are probably roughly the same scale as my pay scale as my project managers, but the project is so much bigger.
And we're not relying on somebody that's a state staff person, running a project somewhere else. We're looking at outside candidates that, because there is an entry level avenue to hire into this level. The problem is because of how the economy has adjusted, the pay externally is a lot more than what we can meet. So there lies the challenge when you're managing a project of this scale. If you're doing it outside of the state, you're going to get paid a lot more money.
But if we fail to find someone through a selection process, we'll outsource this, but it'll be 100% increase in cost on the position. So that's not our first choice, for sure.
And we're doing that simultaneously. Yeah. We're looking down both paths. So we're not waiting to say, okay, I've exhausted this avenue and then let's do something else. We're looking currently simultaneously for this role.
Ms. Higa?
Thank you. So I wanted to make a comment and then I have a question. So Paul, the question you had about the project procurement phase, schedule resource loading, that was one of the things that we talked about briefly in terms of just making sure the board would understand what that meant and also just giving us a sense of kind of proportionality. You know, we've got maybe 10 items that are risks. Are they risks that are 10s or 5s or just 1s? And I think that'll be helpful going forward. The question I have is on the category. There's one of the categories that is yellow. It's the organizational change and training management. It says that the consultant's contract ended and the position will not be replaced, but then the next bullet says the team interviewed for 2 positions and decided to fill 1. So we're not going to have a consultant, but we still have staff vacancies that we're trying to fill? Yes. Is that right? Okay.
We have a team.
Yeah.
We have an entire change management team. They'll be internal.
Yeah, we had a contractor on staff or a consultant on staff to help develop the project management, change management team that would be carrying on a strategy moving forward. And so that team, we're still hiring a couple of the activities. The consultant's contract ended and we are developing or have developed the path forward to continue the change management and employer readiness activities that are going to be moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll move on to data preparation projects. So if you remember, the purpose of this project is really to prepare the ground for data conversion and cleansing for the pension solution and to make that process, somewhat more easier than it might have been otherwise. The next major milestone for that project is presenting a strategy to the EPIC Council, CalSA's internal Portfolio Management Council in July. And that strategy would be basically a proposal of how to deal with a range of data issues, the data issues that were previously identified by the project. And it pretty much defines the scope for the next stage of work. The project has been experiencing some resource challenges in terms of getting all the required resources, and we think it's reasonably likely that they won't have that strategy in place by the July deadline. That said, the priorities of which types of data are going to have to be addressed in what order are likely to change in the near term because there is an activity that's going to be starting with CGI pretty soon to review their proposed schedule. So in terms of what they plan to implement in what sequence, and discuss that with CalSTAs, that is going to inform the project about which specific types of data are going to be impacted first. And so what we're looking for is basically a plan for how the project will address those sort of near-term high-priority issues as they become known over the next few weeks, while balancing the longer-term strategic plan that's necessary to make some sort of larger policy issues. That's something that's still in progress. Questions?
Any additional questions on that? Comments? Seeing none. Okay. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay, very good. So as we go forward, I'm sure Graham's going to take into consideration the comments and suggestions that Joy brought to his attention at lunch, and any other feedback, please channel it through me, and I'll work with Cassandra to make sure that we're presenting the information back to staff and our consultant as to what level of information we want to be brought to our attention, in what format, so that we're getting the right appropriate amount of information in the appropriate language for us to digest, and so that we have the appropriate oversight over this whole project. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Jack, it's
Thanks. Yeah.
Chief Executive Report.
You guys put that PowerPoint up. I'm just going to do a few of these slides. We're not doing the whole thing, but I wanted to highlight a couple of these. But first off, the most important thing in my report is not this, but the reelection of 2 of our board members. It is final. Harry and Sharon are way ahead of schedule, and their new terms start January 1st. 9 months ahead of schedule, saved us a ton of election costs. As you saw in my write-up, they are running unopposed, so the regulation allows for us to certify their election, and they are proceeding as now elected members. For the third seat, we have Dana Dillon as a qualified candidate and Maggie Ellis. So we're proceeding with the election process as we've presented that to you. So good work, guys. So I thought I wanted to highlight a couple things in these slides. This comes from, obviously it's not my presentation. Diane Oakley, our executive director in Washington, D.C., did this presentation. And I think it's good to look at a couple of these. It helps frame public sentiment about what we do here. You know, we're so used to all of this political agitation around public pensions and retirement. It's hard to know sometimes just where is the center of attitudes around these things. And I guess before we look at the data for a minute, I kind of picture two contrasting issues. One, we've got the agitation of a former city councilman in Colorado Springs. Where'd that come from? That was good. San Diego. That's our version of Colorado Springs. That's why we have former city councilman of San Diego and a mayor of a city promoting a ballot initiative potentially in 2016 that would, again, from their perspective, attempt to restrain some of the constitutional rights of public employees and address their concerns around growing liabilities and public pensions. So we have some hysteria that continues around public employees and public pensions that is agitated by a few individuals. On the other side, we've got now California and a number of states that have passed these secure choice laws, which are attempting to address very substantial deficits in personal savings of the population. And remember, apart from the defined benefit issue with public employees, when we dip into the private sector, we only have half of that private sector really that's even offering a retirement plan of any kind. So when we're often, I think, misdirected when we see that $145,000 average 401k balance and it looks so paltry. It's really quite inflated because when you average in all the zeros for people that aren't saving, it really goes down to about $12,000 as the average savings for most people in America. So on the one hand, we've got concerns about do we have a retirement crisis or not? And on the other hand, we've got a political piece around public employees and defined benefit plans. So every 2 years, through our membership in NERS, we sponsored an opinion poll across America around just some broad perceptions on retirement security. I'm just going to show you a couple of these because a couple touch on teachers in particular. And you can read through the findings. But first off, you know, what is the overall sentiment in the country? Is it a narrow issue around government workers and the fact that we don't have a pension like them and they've got a pension? Or is there broad concern that there is a crisis? And consistently, when we've done this national opinion poll, people say, absolutely, there is a retirement crisis. I don't think I have the slide for you, but when we ask them their confidence level that that'll be solved by our public policy leaders in Washington, very low confidence. In fact, when you ask millennials that question, it's almost 100% lack the confidence that public policymakers will address this retirement crisis. So now there is clear generational differences in their perception of that issue as well. This is interesting too, because as you get farther out from the recent recession and the markets stabilize and grow, are people still anxious about their retirement, or are they starting to get more comfortable with their 401k in the private sector and their opportunity to save? And the data would suggest people are anxious still, highly anxious about their opportunity to have a secure retirement in general. I'm just going to flip to a couple more. Generally, when you ask people, do they support the idea for pensions and a guaranteed income? Strong agreement for that model that we've had in the country for so long. And then I want to compare the next two slides for you because I think it's almost counterintuitive to some people, the timing around the dates on this and how the data is shown. So the dark green bar is the most current opinion data, and then the yellow is 2013 and the grayish bar is 2011. So although we've had years and years of discussion on public pension plans and this constant battle going on about the level of benefits, the level of support each time we do this survey, and whether we're looking at fire and police Or if we're looking at teachers, it's showing extremely high support for teachers. They deserve these pensions as basically compensating for low pay. And those numbers have gone up in the strongly agree category each year in the strongest category. So right now, 75% of Americans are indicating support for teachers in this survey. So again, I think when we pull back from some of the drama and see, well, how do people feel about these? There's considerable respect and appreciation for this type of pension plan that CalSTRS offers to its teachers. We often show that dollar bill, as does CalPERS, to show what is the source of support for these pensions. And of course, the majority of it comes from the investment portfolio. But most people kind of misjudge that, thinking it's much higher, the contribution that comes from taxpayers. So this kind of documents that. And then I wanted to show you, this one I found very interesting to show you the significant differences between public sector employees and private sector employees. Simple question of salary versus retirement benefits. Is it come from the type of employees that are attracted to those different sectors, or does it come from employment once you're there, that different perception? I don't know the chicken and the egg to that, but we've often talked about the extraordinary value that's placed on retirement benefits in the public sector, and this data really shows that very strongly, what we're looking at. And then just finally, I want to again underscore that slide. Because there's always talk in Washington every year about reforming Social Security and the problems with entitlement benefits being such a significant part of federal budgets. But when you ask Americans what they think about Social Security, they are definitely opposed to Social Security cuts. And I think this fits well with the other data that shows that so many people that don't even have a 401k, this is their lifeline for retirement security, is Social Security. So to the extent we can be successful with secure choice type programs, this is very important. In fact, I want to go back to that one slide. This is particularly speaks to the program here. How do Americans generally support state efforts to expand retirement savings? And in fact, again, this came back extremely positive, that these programs are important for people and should be well received. So I think that's a real concern that at the one hand, some of the financial industry has been reluctant or resistant to establishing these programs, but from the public's perspective, they're going to be very important to stabilize their retirement savings on top of their Social Security. So just not big surprises here, but I think it fills in some important statistical holes around what we're thinking. Okay? Yeah. And I think that was all I had to highlight there. Yeah.
Thank you. 19 is a new business and review of information request. Do we have any of those? I think we did.
I have a pretty long list of them.
Yeah, we do. Pardon?
Unless you want me to read them, I was just going to put them
It's not necessary. We trust that you got the good list going for us. Okay, terrific. Thank you, Ms. Yamani. It's a long day, and it's tough to try to keep track of all of the requests. You do a nice job for us. We appreciate it. The draft agenda for the next board meeting, I just pulled that up to just bring to your attention a couple of items. There's the closed session, issues related to the CEO and CIO positions. Those are in closed session. That's important to highlight. In open session, we'll be making some appointments to the chairs and vice chairs of committees. So, Jack, how should we funnel those requests? Should we put those?
Yeah, we've got a form that we'll send out to everyone to express their interest.
Yeah.
I'll get that out.
If you have an interest in continuing, if you're serving as chair or vice chair of a committee at this point and you'd like to continue in that capacity, I believe that strongly that people who are in a position maybe more than 1 year in that role is good for us, and because you build some knowledge and Frank, but certainly if you have a preference, a strong preference, please let us know through the form that's sent out. And I'll work with Sharon and we'll make those assignments for next year.
You know, one thing on that, I don't know if you want to talk about, certainly not now, but I just want to flag it for you. One of your offsite decisions was around the governance committee, and I don't know if you, do you want me to leave that on the interest list for
Yes.
now until
Yes.
you process that?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll leave that on, but I assume you've been relatively happy with the way we've been doing the legislation. We should leave it like it is?
Ledge rolled right into the full
Embedded the board
board.
meeting?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll adjust that for
Please,
doing
Jeff,
that.
yeah.
And then, you know, as you saw in there, Jane is going to do her report.
Jane's report is in the information report. And thanks to everybody for participating. I think, you know, all the surveys were conducted, tabulated, interviews were held. So there's going to be a lot of information and I would assume some probably recommendations and suggestions that might come forward as well.
Right. You know, and in the companion piece that I just checked this morning to see if we were on schedule, and we are. We won't do a long presentation, but we will be completed our first GRI, or Global Reporting Initiative, sustainability report for CalSTRS. And when I checked with the folks in Amsterdam that are responsible for that, it was their perception we'll be the first U.S. pension fund to have completed one. So I think we can display that and just take a few minutes with that
We might
too.
want to take more than a few minutes. I mean,
Okay.
that's a big accomplishment. So I think it would be great to do that in June.
Great.
Anything else that we wanted to flag from that?
And well, fiduciary training with
Right.
with your new council.
Okay.
That's also item number 12.
And Sharon and I are going to talk a little bit about that as well. So,
Okay.
Mr. Rosensteel?
Yeah, so the sustainability project report, it's listed here as an information item, but I think somebody just mentioned something that there might be some recommendations. Are we going to are we planning to take action so it's not just an information item?
If there's actionable, if there's action to be taken, it will come back as an action item. We've been in touch. I've spoken with Jane. I think you weren't able to be on that call to update us. So if there's some suggestions that are worthy of action, or could be no action, recommendation would be no action. You don't do anything other than what you're doing. So
But
it's
it
to
would
be
come back
determined.
At a later meeting for action or in June?
No, depending upon what the recommended action is, if it's a modest, recommendation for the Green Team and Brian Rice to provide more input into the work that's already being done, I think that's an easy thing for us to take action on. But if it's more substantive or a significant change, I think that would be worthy of discussion and then come back as action at a later date.
But if they're making any recommendations for action, we'll get those recommendations before the meeting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And I think that's it. So item 20A, opportunities for members of the public. Comments? No, we don't see any. And so our open session meeting is adjourned. We will we're going into closed session. We've got one item that's pretty lengthy. So why don't we take, maybe 15 minutes to just unwind a little bit. Thank you.